Why did my landlord evict me when I was in the hospital with my dying daughter? The eviction notice was taped to my apartment door when I came home at 2:43 a.m. to grab clean clothes for my 8-year-old daughter who'd been in the pediatric ICU for 6 days. I stood there in the hallway with my keys still in my hand, staring at the official court document that gave me 72 hours to vacate the premises. The reason listed was lease violation and property damage. I hadn't been home long enough in the past week to violate anything or damage anything. I'd been living in a hospital room watching my daughter fight for her life after a car accident that had crushed her chest and put her in a coma. The notice was dated 3 days earlier, which meant I technically had less than 24 hours before the sheriff could legally remove my belongings and change the locks. My hands started shaking so badly the paper rustled like dead leaves. I'd been renting apartment 3B at 847 Riverside Terrace for 4 years when the accident happened. It was a modest 2-bedroom in an older building with temperamental heating and outdated appliances, but the rent was reasonable at $1,150 per month, and the location was perfect, just 6 blocks from my daughter Lily's elementary school and 15 minutes from the hospital where I worked as a phlebotomist. The landlord was a man named Richard Castellano, who owned 3 buildings in the neighborhood and ran his rental empire from a cluttered office above a dry cleaner on Maple Street. He was in his late 50s, overweight, always sweating slightly, and had a habit of showing up unannounced to inspect properties or collect rent personally, even though we all paid through an online portal. Lily's mother, my ex-wife Rachel, had moved to Oregon 2 years earlier with her new husband. She sent child support irregularly and called Lily every few weeks, but she'd essentially checked out of daily parenting. It had been just Lily and me for 2 years, building a quiet routine of school drop-offs, evening homework sessions, weekend trips to the library, and occasional splurges at the ice cream shop on Fifth Avenue. Lily was bright and funny, obsessed with dinosaurs and space exploration, and had recently decided she wanted to be a paleontologist when she grew up. She'd covered her bedroom walls with posters of the solar system and dinosaur skeletons, and I'd been saving up to take her to the Natural History Museum in the city for her 9th birthday in 2 months. The accident happened on a Saturday afternoon in late September. Lily had been walking home from her friend's house 3 blocks away, something she'd done dozens of times before. A delivery truck running a red light had clipped a sedan that spun out of control onto the sidewalk. Lily had been caught between the car and a brick wall. By the time I got the call from the emergency room, she'd already been in surgery for 3 hours. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Angela Rourke, a 20-year veteran with steady hands and kind eyes, had explained that Lily had suffered severe chest trauma, fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, and internal bleeding. They'd stabilized her, but the next 72 hours would be critical. She was in an induced coma to let her body heal without the stress of consciousness. I'd barely left the hospital since then. I'd called my supervisor at work, explained the situation, and used all my emergency leave. I'd been sleeping in the chair beside Lily's bed, eating whatever I could grab from the cafeteria, and spending 18-hour days watching monitors and praying for improvements in her vitals. I'd gone home exactly 3 times in 6 days, always in the middle of the night, always just long enough to shower, change clothes, and grab mail. The apartment had been exactly as I'd left it each time. Dishes in the sink, Lily's homework still spread across the kitchen table, her backpack hanging by the door. Nothing damaged, nothing violated, nothing that would justify eviction. Standing in the hallway at nearly 3 in the morning, holding an eviction notice while my daughter fought for her life 6 miles away, I felt something crack inside my chest. This couldn't be real. This had to be a mistake, some bureaucratic error that would be cleared up with a phone call. I pulled out my phone and called Richard's number, not caring that it was the middle of the night. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice shaking with exhaustion and confusion, explaining about Lily's accident and asking him to call me immediately about the eviction notice. I grabbed clothes, Lily's favorite stuffed dinosaur that I'd forgotten on my last trip, and headed back to the hospital. The drive passed in a blur of streetlights and empty intersections. When I got back to Lily's room, she looked exactly the same as when I'd left, small and pale against white sheets, connected to machines that breathed for her and monitored every function of her struggling body. I sat back down in my chair and held her hand, which was warm and alive, and I tried not to think about what losing our apartment would mean while she was like this. Richard called back at 9:30 that morning. I was in the hallway outside Lily's room because hospital policy didn't allow phone calls in the ICU. His voice was flat and businesslike when he told me the eviction was legitimate and non-negotiable. I asked what lease violations he was referring to, what property damage he'd documented. He said I'd failed to maintain the premises in acceptable condition, that neighbors had complained about noise and disturbances, and that there had been unauthorized occupants in the unit. Every single claim was false. I'd kept the apartment clean and quiet. There had been no parties, no noise complaints, no extra people living there. It was just Lily and me living normal, boring lives until the accident. I tried to explain about Lily, about the hospital, about the impossibility of me having violated anything while I'd been camped out in a pediatric intensive care unit. Richard's response made my stomach drop. He said my personal problems weren't his concern and that I'd been served proper legal notice. If I didn't vacate by the deadline, the sheriff would forcibly remove my belongings and I'd be responsible for storage fees and additional legal costs. Then he hung up. Just like that. No sympathy, no flexibility, No acknowledgement that evicting a single father while his child was dying was monstrous. I stood in the hospital hallway with my phone in my hand, feeling like I'd been punched. Over the next 8 hours, I made 16 phone calls trying to find help. I called legal aid services, tenant rights organizations, the court clerk's office, trying to understand my options. What I learned was devastating. In our state, landlords could file for eviction for lease violations with minimal evidence, and once served, tenants had very limited time to respond. The hearing for my case had already happened 3 days earlier, scheduled during a time when I'd been sitting beside Lily's hospital bed, completely unaware I was being sued. The court had issued a default judgment in Richard's favor because I hadn't appeared to defend myself. The eviction was legal and enforceable unless I could prove fraud or file an emergency motion to vacate the judgment. A paralegal at a tenant advocacy organization named Lisa Nakamura, who'd worked in housing law for 8 years, walked me through my options in a phone call that lasted 20 minutes. She said I could file an emergency motion explaining about Lily's accident and arguing I hadn't received proper notice, but I'd need documentation and a lawyer, and the motion would take time to process. Even if I won, it would only delay the eviction temporarily. To actually fight it, I'd need to prove Richard's claims about lease violations were false, which meant gathering evidence, attending hearings, and potentially months of legal battle. Meanwhile, I had less than 12 hours before the sheriff could legally throw my stuff into the street. I called my bank and checked my balance. I had $2,340 in savings and another $680 in checking. Not enough for first month, last month, security deposit, and moving costs on a new apartment. Not enough to fight a legal battle against a landlord with resources and time. Not enough to do anything except maybe rent a storage unit and try to salvage my belongings before they were confiscated. I was working full-time before the accident, but phlebotomist salaries didn't leave much room for emergency funds, especially when raising a kid alone. Every extra dollar had gone toward Lily's activities, her school supplies, building a small cushion for emergencies. This was the kind of emergency that made that cushion look pathetically small. That afternoon, while Lily's monitors beeped their steady rhythm and her chest rose and fell with the ventilator, I started making calls to find temporary housing. Shelters were full or had waiting lists. Extended stay motels wanted $85 per night, which would drain my savings in 3 weeks. Friends offered couches, but nobody had space for me and potentially a recovering child with serious medical needs. My parents were both dead, killed in a car accident when I was in college. Rachel's family had never liked me and had made it clear after the divorce they weren't interested in maintaining contact. I had coworkers, acquaintances, casual friends, but nobody I felt comfortable asking for the level of help I needed. By 6 p.m., I'd arranged for a storage unit and a moving truck rental for the next morning. It would cost $340 for the truck and first month of storage, eating through my cash reserves, but it was better than losing everything. I'd asked my supervisor if I could crash in the hospital's on-call room between shifts once I returned to work, and she'd said she'd look into it but made no promises. The plan was barely a plan, more like organized desperation, but it was all I had. That night, I left the hospital at 11 p.m. and drove to my apartment to start packing. The building was quiet and dark, except for the security light in the lobby that flickered intermittently. When I got to my door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lock had been changed. My key wouldn't turn. There was a new notice taped to the door, this one from the sheriff's office, stating the premises had been secured due to court order, and I was prohibited from entering without permission. I'd had 18 hours left. They'd locked me out 6 hours early. I called Richard immediately. No answer. I called the sheriff's office and was told by a board dispatcher that landlord-tenant issues weren't emergency police matters, and I'd need to contact the court during business hours. I explained my daughter was in the hospital, and all her belongings were locked inside. The dispatcher said she understood my situation was difficult, but they couldn't override a court order. I asked where my belongings were. She said they should still be inside the unit, and I'd need to arrange with the landlord for access to retrieve them. I sat in my car in the parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, trying to breathe through the panic closing my throat. Everything Lily and I owned was locked inside that apartment. Her clothes, her school things, her dinosaur books and space posters, her birth certificate and social security card, my work uniforms and documents, photos of her as a baby, the only copies I had, the stuffed elephant her grandmother had given her before she died, all of it trapped behind a door I could no longer open, held hostage by a landlord who'd evicted me while my daughter lay unconscious in intensive care. I spent that night in my car in the hospital parking lot, the seat reclined as far as it would go, trying to sleep in 30-minute increments between the cold and the streetlights and the voices of people coming and going from the ER. At 7 a.m., I went inside, washed up in the public restroom, and bought coffee and a muffin from the cafeteria with my credit card. Lily's condition was unchanged. Doctor. Rourke came by on morning rounds and said the next 48 hours would tell us whether she'd wake up or whether there had been brain damage from oxygen deprivation during the accident. I nodded and thanked her and didn't mention that I'd just become homeless. I spent the morning trying to reach Richard again. His voicemail was full and wouldn't accept messages. I called his property management office and was told by a receptionist named Gloria that Mr. Castellano was out of town on business and wouldn't be available until the following week. I asked about accessing my belongings from the apartment, and Gloria said I'd need written permission from Mr. Castellano and proof of identity, and appointments for property retrieval had to be scheduled 48 hours in advance. I explained about my daughter and the hospital and the illegal early lockout. Gloria's tone shifted from bureaucratic to openly hostile. She said if I had issues with the eviction, I should take them up with the court, and that harassing office staff wouldn't change the outcome. That's when I realized something was very wrong beyond just a landlord being cruel. Richard had evicted me based on fabricated violations, scheduled the court hearing while I was at the hospital, changed the locks before the legal deadline, and then disappeared. This wasn't just callousness or bad timing. This was deliberate. He'd waited until I was at my most vulnerable, and then systematically removed my housing and access to my belongings with calculated precision. But I couldn't figure out why. I'd been a model tenant for 4 years, always paid rent on time, never caused problems, kept to myself. There was no reason for him to target me specifically, unless there was something I was missing. I called Lisa Nakamura, the paralegal from Tenant Advocacy, and explained the situation, the early lockout, the inaccessible belongings, the landlord who'd disappeared. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my stomach twist. She said Richard Castellano's name had come up before in tenant complaints, always following the same pattern. He'd evict long-term tenants on false pretenses, lock them out of their units, and then within weeks, the apartments would be listed for rent at significantly higher rates. She said he was likely running a scheme to clear out rent-controlled or long-term tenants so he could jack up prices for new renters. She said it was illegal, but proving it required documentation and legal resources most tenants didn't have. That afternoon, I walked to the public library and used their computers to research Richard Castellano's rental properties. What I found was a pattern that confirmed Lisa's suspicion. Over the past 2 years, 8 tenants from Richard's 3 buildings had been evicted. All had been long-term renters paying below market rates. All had been evicted for lease violations like property damage or unauthorized occupants, violations that were difficult to disprove. Within 30 to 60 days of each eviction, their units had been listed for rent at prices 30 to 50% higher than what the previous tenant had paid. My apartment, which I'd rented for $1,150, was already listed on rental websites for $1,650. I printed out everything I could find, screenshots of rental listings, public records of eviction filings, property tax information showing Richard's ownership. I was building a case, but I didn't yet know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I couldn't let him destroy my life and Lily's future without fighting back. The breakthrough came 2 days later from an unexpected source. I was in the hospital cafeteria, trying to force down a sandwich I couldn't taste, when a woman approached my table. She introduced herself as Simone Alvarez, an investigative journalist with the local newspaper who'd been researching predatory landlord practices in the area. She said she'd been tipped off by Lisa Nakamura that I might be willing to talk about my experience with Richard Castellano. Simone was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and direct, with 10 years of experience covering housing issues and a Pulitzer nomination for a series on slumlords. She bought me a coffee and listened to my entire story without interrupting. When I finished, Simone pulled out a folder and showed me what she'd been working on. She'd been tracking Richard for 8 months, interviewing former tenants, reviewing court records, documenting the pattern of fraudulent evictions. She had testimony from 6 other families he'd displaced, all with similar stories of false violations and suspicious timing. What she needed was someone willing to go on the record with recent documentation and a compelling personal story. She said my situation, being evicted while my daughter was hospitalized, was exactly the kind of case that would make the public and authorities pay attention. I asked what going public would accomplish. Simone explained that exposing Richard's pattern in print would trigger investigations by housing authorities and potentially criminal charges for fraud and harassment. It would also put pressure on the court to review the evictions and potentially reverse them. She said former tenants had already filed a class action lawsuit with help from a legal aid attorney named Gerald Fitzpatrick, who'd agreed to represent them pro bono. If I joined the lawsuit and went on record with my story, it would strengthen everyone's case and potentially force Richard to settle or face serious legal consequences. The risk was that going public meant exposing my family's trauma, putting my daughter's medical crisis in the newspaper for strangers to read about and judge. It meant facing Richard's retaliation and potentially making myself unemployable if future landlords saw me as a troublemaker. But the alternative was letting him get away with it, moving on to destroy other families while I tried to rebuild from nothing. I thought about Lily, about the kind of father I wanted her to see when she woke up, assuming she woke up. I wanted her to see someone who fought back when powerful people abused their power. I told Simone I'd do it. The article ran 4 days later on the front page of the local section. The headline was, "Landlord Evicts Father While Daughter Fights for Life in ICU." Simone had written a detailed account of my eviction, complete with hospital records I'd authorized her to access, court documents showing the timeline of Richard's eviction filing, and expert testimony from housing advocates about the illegality of his tactics. She'd also included the broader pattern, naming Richard specifically and detailing his history of fraudulent evictions and rent inflation. The article included quotes from other displaced tenants and a statement from Gerald Fitzpatrick about the pending lawsuit. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's website crashed from traffic. Local TV news picked up the story and sent crews to interview me at the hospital. Social media exploded with outrage. housing advocacy groups held a press conference demanding the city investigate Richard's properties and business practices. The mayor's office issued a statement saying they took housing fraud seriously and would be directing the Code Enforcement Division to audit all of Richard's buildings. Richard's lawyer, a slick corporate attorney named Philip Greaves, sent the newspaper a threatening letter demanding a retraction and claiming the article was defamatory. Simone's editor responded with a point-by-point rebuttal backed by documented evidence and refused to retract anything. The newspaper's legal team was confident the story was airtight. What I hadn't anticipated was the financial support. A GoFundMe page that someone had set up without my knowledge or permission raised $34,000 in 3 days. Strangers from across the country donated money to help with legal fees and housing costs, leaving comments about their own experiences with predatory landlords and expressing support for Lily's recovery. The outpouring was so overwhelming I had to pull over on the drive to the hospital and cry in a gas station parking lot. Gerald Fitzpatrick, the legal aid attorney, was a 62-year-old veteran of tenant rights litigation with a reputation for taking on cases nobody else would touch. He called me the day after the article ran and offered to represent me individually in addition to the class action suit. He said he'd file an emergency motion to vacate the eviction judgment based on improper service and fraud, and he'd petition for immediate access to my apartment to retrieve my belongings. He worked fast. Within 48 hours, he'd filed the motions and scheduled a hearing with Judge Monica Hensley, a 28-year veteran of housing court, known for being tough on landlord abuse. The hearing happened on a Friday morning, 11 days after Lily's accident. I'd arranged for a nurse I'd become friendly with to call me if there were any changes in Lily's condition. I sat in the courtroom beside Gerald, watching Richard and his lawyer at the opposite table. Richard looked annoyed and put upon, like this whole situation was a minor inconvenience rather than the destruction of multiple families. His lawyer presented arguments about property rights and legitimate business practices, claiming Richard had every right to enforce lease terms and that my personal situation didn't override his contractual authority. Gerald systematically dismantled their arguments. He presented evidence of Richard's pattern of fraudulent evictions, testimony from former tenants, expert analysis showing the rent increases following evictions, and documentation of the early lockout and improper service in my case. He showed the judge hospital records proving I'd been at Lily's bedside during the court date I'd allegedly missed. He played a recording from my voicemail where Richard explicitly said my personal problems weren't his concern, demonstrating callousness that shocked even the court reporter. Judge Hensley was a thin woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to both sides without visible emotion, took notes, and then delivered a ruling that made Richard's face go red. She vacated the eviction judgment, citing improper service and evidence of fraudulent claims. She ordered Richard to immediately restore my access to the apartment and prohibited any further eviction proceedings without substantial documented evidence of actual lease violations. She also referred the case to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential housing fraud and ordered Richard to pay my legal fees and court costs. Richard's lawyer started to object, but Judge Hensley cut him off. She said she'd been watching patterns in housing court for 3 decades and had seen landlords like Richard come and go. She said what he'd done, targeting a father during a family medical crisis based on fabricated violations, was not just unethical, but possibly criminal. She said if even half of what the newspaper had reported was accurate, Richard was looking at serious civil and criminal liability. I walked out of that courtroom with a court order granting me immediate access to my apartment and legal protection against further harassment. Gerald handed me the paperwork and said this was just the beginning. The class action lawsuit was moving forward, the Attorney General had opened an investigation, and the city's housing authority was auditing all of Richard's properties for code violations and illegal eviction practices. That afternoon, I met a locksmith at my apartment building with the court order in hand. Richard's property manager, Gloria, was there with a sour expression, forced to comply with the judge's order. The locksmith changed the locks back, and I was given new keys. When I opened the door, everything was exactly as I'd left it, untouched. Nothing had been damaged or removed. The whole eviction had been a scheme to get me out so Richard could charge the next tenant 40% more. I packed essential items, Lily's comfort things, important documents, and then I drove back to the hospital. Lily was still unconscious, still fighting, but her vitals had improved slightly. Dr. Rourke said there were signs of brain activity increasing, which was encouraging. I sat beside her bed, held her hand, and told her about the court hearing and the judge and how we'd won. I told her we still had our home, that everything was going to be okay. Lily woke up 2 days later. Her eyes opened at 6:15 in the morning, confused and frightened, and the first thing she said was, "Daddy?" I was there. I'd been there the whole time. I held her hand and told her she was safe, and I loved her, and she was going to be fine. Dr. Rourke came running when the nurses called her, and after examining Lily and running tests, she said the prognosis was good. No apparent brain damage, lungs healing well, recovery would take months, but was expected to be complete. The lawsuit against Richard took 8 months to resolve. The Attorney General's investigation uncovered systematic fraud, falsified eviction documents, and evidence that Richard had bribed a court clerk to schedule hearings at times when displaced tenants were unlikely to appear. Richard was charged with multiple counts of fraud, harassment, and criminal conspiracy. He pled guilty to avoid trial and received 3 years in prison, 5 years probation, and a permanent ban from owning rental properties in the state. The class action lawsuit settled for $840,000, split among 9 displaced families. My share was $78,000, enough to cover Lily's medical bills that insurance didn't pay, create a real emergency fund, and put down payment on a small house in a better neighborhood. Other families used their settlements to rebuild lives that Richard had tried to destroy. The city implemented new regulations requiring landlords to provide documented proof of lease violations before filing evictions and established a tenant defense fund to help families fight fraudulent proceedings. Simone won a state journalism award for her investigative series on housing fraud. Lisa Nakamura's tenant advocacy organization received a major grant to expand their services. A year later, Lily is in 4th grade, thriving despite the scars across her chest from surgeries. She still loves dinosaurs and space. She wrote a school report about what happened, titling it, "How My Dad Fought a Dragon," casting Richard as the villain and herself as the rescued princess, which made me cry when her teacher sent me a copy. She doesn't fully understand what Richard tried to do to us, but she knows her father didn't let a powerful person destroy their family. I see Richard occasionally around town. He works at a car wash now, the terms of his probation prohibiting him from property management. He pretends not to recognize me. I don't acknowledge him either. He's already lost everything that mattered to him, his business, his reputation, his freedom. I don't need anything more from him. The trauma of those weeks, watching Lily fight for life while simultaneously fighting to keep our home, changed something fundamental in how I see the world. I learned that systems we trust to be fair often aren't, that people with power will exploit the vulnerable without hesitation, and that the only protection is fighting back with evidence and refusing to disappear quietly. I learned that community support and investigative journalism can bring down even seemingly untouchable abusers. Most importantly, I learned that being a good father sometimes means being willing to fight publicly and ferociously for what's right. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.